Did you know that mindfulness influences decision making? I know, pretty cool, right? Come on, let's learn more. Hi, I'm Ted Meissner, and welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. If you are returning to this podcast, welcome back. Good to see you again. And if this is your first time visiting, I'm glad you could join us. Thank you so much for being here. There's recent studies to show that mindfulness influences how we make decisions, especially in times of uncertainty. I don't know about you, but uncertainty is something that I frequently encounter with every decision I make. So our guest today will tell us a little bit more about what that research says. Our guest today is Marius Golubikis. Thank you so much for being here. Good to meet you, and thank you for spending time with us today.
Hi, Dad. Thank you for having me.
So, what I'd like to start with is just have you give us the elevator pitch on what this recent paper is about. It's learning when there's some uncertainty. There seems to be a lot there, and I'm wondering if you could just say
Yeah,
what it's like for someone who hasn't read the paper.
yeah. There's a lot going on. Well, so we were interested in how can brief mindfulness facilitate learning. Learning can occur in many different ways, and I think one of the, I guess, more interesting ways, at least for me, is of probabilistic learning, and which refers to things not being necessarily for certain. So not necessarily meaning correct or incorrect or the right or wrong choice. Sometimes things when you choose, it could be potentially good, but you don't know the answer, right? Um, so for instance, if sometimes a friend could be nice, other times the friend could be not so nice, right? So things like that. And the learning aspect in all of this is associated more with rewards and punishments, I suppose, right? So in psychology, it's often called reinforcement learning. So reinforcement is when how can we modify and change our behavior in the simple terms, right? So if you have some sort of habit or that you want to get rid of or reinforce it, enhance it, and do it more frequently. Let's say wake up early in the mornings and meditate, or wake up early in the mornings and go for a walk. How can you sort of modify and increase that behavior? So that's what sort of reinforcement learning in a nutshell does. So we were interested in seeing how even brief periods of mindfulness can potentially influence, facilitate, and the sort of the performance, the learning. And participants were divided into groups. In one group, participants performed 5 minutes mindfulness meditation. So this was focused on sort of breathing. So it's a bit of mindful breathing, guided meditation. So a voice guides you through it, tells you to be non-judgmental towards the thoughts that come in, just let them experience them as a passing state. Um, and after that, they performed a learning task. The other group had exactly the same, but instead of doing mindfulness, they performed a task that doesn't really influence mood or anything else, which was a puzzle task.
So you
So
had an active control group, and this is one of the things I liked about the research was it wasn't just wait list where you participate in something that itself is going to influence you. You had a particular task to try to get to the key ingredient. So nicely done.
exactly, it's a big problem. In terms of control conditions, I think it's one of the biggest issues in mindfulness research because people, whatever you do, there's always a certain type of trade-off, right? So we used to use this control condition where it did sort of the opposite, right? It guided you, but it made you focus more towards the thoughts, right? So you sort of overly focusing. So it's almost like the opposite of what mindfulness tries to do, right? So be overly self-involved or overly thinking in your thoughts. So and that usually works really well. But then again, the feedback we got from it was that maybe there's some bad trade-offs going on, right? So there's always been this sort of issue, and still is a big issue in mindfulness research. I think is that what is the real good control, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic that we're I think I'm going to have an entirely separate episode on doing good research within mindfulness.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, what's one of the things that made you interested in doing this particular research of just a short mindfulness intervention and its influence on learning? How did this paper come about?
Well, so I'm primarily a self-researcher. So I research how does the self influence variety of cognitive, and previously I looked at social aspects. So in the last probably just under 10 years, I've been looking in things like decision making, primarily how self facilitates the speed to which we process decisions, so the enhancement aspects of the self, right? And self associations and ownership as well is within the same sort of pool. And so while I was researching that, I came across sort of started looking at different aspects that the self can influence, right? Which was attention. Also looked at what's it called? Learning, right? So the learning sort of came into about a couple of years ago, and I sort of got quite fascinated by it because it seems like a really broad and influential sort of topic and aspect of cognition. So um, after researching the self and how does the self influence learning, it was kind of natural for me to transition into the mindfulness. And I guess I forgot to mention. So um, the mindfulness journey itself started again with this idea of, well, first starting with researching self and finding out that, especially in Western view, the self is really permanent, sort of constant structure, psychological construct. But if you look at the East, this self gets more and more malleable, right? So there's been lots of evidence, let's say, that even cultural differences in East Asia, let's say, are much smaller compared to the Western population. And then if you look even deeper, a lot of mindfulness literature talks about this idea of no self, right? So the elimination of the self. So we use this egocentrism task that it's not sort of typical egocentrism task where it's about perspective taking. It's more about perception of the self. Maybe you heard of this is the spotlight effect. So the spotlight effect is when you have a new haircut, you come into the room and you think everybody's going to see that you have a haircut, right? But nobody does. Like nobody even, bats an eye. So that's a spotlight effect. We believe that the spotlight is on us, right? And this is
And Dostoevsky made reference to this with Crime and Punishment. The
yeah,
central character had just done something he thought everybody knew and everyone was watching. It's that same thing, that heightened awareness that we have based on
yes,
our own perceptions of what's going on.
exactly. So in social psychology, this would be regarded as a egocentric bias, right? You're overly focusing towards yourself. So this is how we kind of all started, and we thought if this idea of no self is real, potentially what you can do by meditating, you should reduce these egocentric biases, right? And this was my first test in terms of exploring mindfulness, which then later sort of gradually started developing into other avenues. And this is where this paper come by exploring self effects. And now I'm trying to look at just more mindfulness on its own, how it can influence and facilitate. Because one of the most fascinating research I found on mindfulness is its influence or on attention. And again, attention, I think, is one of the most fundamental aspects in terms of everyday behavior, right? Everywhere we look, every time we think about something, especially externally, right? It's attention. And it guides our behavior probably the most than any other aspect, decision making or memory, I suppose, as well. But find it really, really interesting. So then from there, it kind of stemmed like, well, what about learning, right? Because again, learning seems a really deeply important aspect in any type of behavior, and reinforcement learning specifically in behavior modification. Um, yeah. So when we run the study with two groups of people, um, and participants had to learn certain types of probability. So it's like a game almost. You see two random symbols on a screen, And so just happened that they have different probabilities of being correct or being reinforced, right? And so what happened that participants who meditated, they learned the probabilities um, faster, right? So they acquired information at a higher speed. But when we use certain computational modeling, so basically trying to understand how exactly they achieve that, we found that participants, not only that they learn from uh, positive prediction errors, what they call it. So that's positive surprise, right? So when the event is better than you expect, right? So you make some modification to your behavior, you get a positive feedback because you're anticipating that you're not going to be able to change that, and you get, oh wow, I did better than I thought I will, right? So that's a positive surprise, right? So specifically on that one, it seems that mindfulness has a interesting power there. The other thing that we found, which we sort of framed our manuscript in this sort of fashion, was that participants had a certain strategy. So participants who meditated, sorry, had a certain strategy, the way they explored the task. And there's with probabilistic scenarios, that's why I find it quite interesting, as opposed to deterministic, right? So where things are for certain, is that that level of uncertainty allows people to, on occasion, check the other option, right? So in UK, I usually use an example about choosing a fish and chip shop, right? So I don't know what's it. So let's say, I think in the manuscript they use Thai restaurant, right, as a sort of more, I guess, relatable example, right? So you're choosing a Thai restaurant, right? And you have a dilemma, right? Are you going to go to the one that you already been and you know that is good? Or you're going to potentially explore potential alternatives, but obviously that can yield worse results, right?
Yeah,
And
might
that's
be great,
essentially what the
might be
learning is.
terrible. Yeah, that's a great example.
It may be completely terrible, right? So, what we found was that after mindful meditation, participants showed higher chances, if, I suppose, a higher rate of exploration, right? This is where we sort of framed the whole thing about being quite open-minded, right? Which is related to the previous research in different areas and mindfulness.
Nice. So I'm curious about these findings because you found these different kinds of conditions, the rate of learning, preference and exploration, increased response caution, these things that you elucidate in the paper very well.
Mhm.
I'm curious about what about these findings might be of interest to people who've never tried meditation and who might benefit from this research.
Um, I think the learning aspect is definitely quite interesting and applicable. So the learning from positive surprises, right? Let's say I have personally a bad habit of snacking when I shouldn't, right? Not a
You're not
midnight snack,
alone.
but a snack past, let's say, 8 p.m., right? So if I would like to sort of get rid, let's say, of this bias, of this, sorry, habit, what I would do, I would potentially could engage in this mindfulness meditation, 5 minutes, and sort of check if I'm snacking or not, right? So I spend the rest of the evening and I maybe made myself not to snack, and maybe it was easy. But from there, I can sort of learn. Maybe I notice like, oh, actually, I meditated. I thought I might snack, but I didn't snack, right? That's a positive surprise, which this surprise should be integrated in behavior modification much more rapidly after meditating, right? So that's the sort of, I guess, real world application in behavior modification.
Yeah, yeah. And what I find interesting about that is with this particular research, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, it was a very short meditation, about 5 minutes,
Mhm.
and it was one particular kind of meditation. And this is one of the things I'm wondering if you're curious about in seeing future research and continuing with this work. What are
Mhm.
the effects of other kinds of meditative practices? And what are those? Might that be different?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a interesting aspect in sort of whether, so this is maybe from an academic point of view interesting, right? But so there's two types of prediction errors, right? Or two types of surprises, right? So sometimes things can, as I said, can be better than you expected, but sometimes they're worse than you expected, right? So an interesting sort of hypothesis could be that different mindfulness practices might target different types of prediction errors or enhance different types of prediction errors, right? Which basically means that depending on what kind of behavior or modification you're looking into, those things might help, right? So different types of meditations can help different things. So in terms of future research, that is definitely something is worth looking into. Um, then loving kindness meditation, I think I wrote something about that in the manuscript, which I thought it would be quite interesting again to see if that could be used in some sort of interpersonal aspects, right? And learning about maybe other groups of people, right? And so on. So I've had a paper where I'm looking at how do we perceive others, and specifically people from different groups, right? So it's more stereotyping literature. And there's a very interesting effects there too, is how to learn to sort of counter stereotypic people, as we call it, right? So people in unusual environments, right? So again, there's could be some overlap there where mindfulness somehow may, facilitate overcoming certain type of more deeply rooted biases.
Yeah, in fact, just this morning on LinkedIn, I posted about another paper that just came out around mindfulness influence on bias. And that
Mm,
the implications for me, it wasn't part of the paper, but the implications for me around inclusion, diversity, equity is
yeah,
quite
yeah.
profound. So I'm eager to see that sort of thing happen. And I'm wondering, as we finish up for today, is there any particular research around perhaps self and mindfulness that you'd like to do that maybe you haven't done yet, or anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yeah. I don't think at the moment I have anything sort of in the pipeline, but yeah, I've a couple of years ago, an article came out as well, looking at the mindfulness and reduction of what we call self-prioritization effect, which is this phenomenon that once we forge an association between ourselves and an object, let's say my mug, right? When we force this association, usually we advantage in the way we process it, right? So that could be a movement. So we're usually much faster to grab our own items than somebody else's. Makes sense. We also allocate a little bit more attentional resources, memory resources. And so I was interested mostly in decision making. So again, we find that people make much more rapid decisions in terms of recognizing their own items, even they really don't own them, but it's called mere ownership effect. But we just tell people that they own, and that's enough for them to sort of show these biases. And what I've done was ask participants to again meditate before the task for 5 minutes, and then they do the task, right? Where they usually show strong self-prioritization effect or self-bias. And it again creates this complete reduction or reduction or even elimination of the self-realization effect, meaning again this aspect of no self presumably playing in, but also there's some interesting sort of rebalancing going on. So in terms of the future research, what I'm quite interested in is really to further explore these core assumptions of mindfulness, such as reduction of bias. And this is like in almost any social bias that can be found, right? I think there's a lot of research to be done in this area, right? Um, so showing the sort of the ability for mindfulness to balance things out, I suppose, right? Rebalancing, I think they call it. Um, and at the same time, I don't think I talked much about this time, but this observation that mindfulness increases caution, right? And I'm really curious about why that happens because every time, and other researchers found the same thing, we find increased caution by mindfulness, right? And always wonder what is that about? Why does that happen, right? Um, so I do have sort of ideas there that it could be sort of related to meta awareness, which seems to be highly related to mindfulness, meaning that you become quite aware of your own workings and your own body and mind and what do you do. So I sort of feel like this caution aspect could be a very important fundamental aspect of mindfulness that occurs throughout contexts, right? Regardless of what task, what cognitive aspect you're measuring, attention, decision making, whatever. Always there's an element of caution that it seems to be increased by meditating,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
Trait, state and trait caution. That was
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, our guest,
For
Marius
having me.
Golubikas. Very much appreciate you being with us. And for those who are listening, I'll have links to Marius' webpage as well as the research we were talking about today. So again, Marius, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
As you can see, there's a lot to decision making. So remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. I'll see you next time.